What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit Down video. Also, if you enjoy cigars, I'm not sure what you're waiting for. You got to go check out our signature sit-down cigar, available now from Pravada Cigar Club. The link to buy is in the pinned comment of this video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And over the years in the city of Philadelphia, we've heard all sorts of names, from Angelo Bruno to Nicky Scarfo to Joey Merlino to Joseph Lagambi. One very interesting individual that we really haven't delved that too far into is John Stanfa. Now, as we know, John Stanfa will go to war of sorts with people like Joey Merlino over the years. But what do we know about John Stanfa's past? We're going to get into it today. The story of John Stanfa next on the Sit Down. Giovanni Stanfa was born December 11th, 1940, in the Sicilian city of Kokomo. Now, Kokomo is about 25 miles southeast of Palermo, and Kokomo is a very mountainous area. It's a small mountainous town on the side of a mountain. It's known for, down in some of the valleys, some of its farming. But there's one thing we know about these mountainous towns in Sicily. They are very enriched with the Mafia, and the Cockamese people and the Cockamese blood is actually all over families like Philadelphia, cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh. And some of that information comes from our friends at the Mob Archaeologists. They have found a lot of blood from Kokomo in some of those cities in really the 10s, the 20s, the 30s. And for John Stanfa, a lot of people don't know his family was extremely connected in Kokomo in the Mafia. Now, John Stanfa was the youngest son of four, and all three of his brothers, including his brother Ciro, as well as his brother Salvatore, and also his brother Nicasio, were all made members of the Sicilian Mafia. Now, what's also interesting about John Stanfa is his nephew, a person called Antonino Gioffre, would eventually become the boss and the representee of Kokomo in terms of the Sicilian Mafia. He would take over in the 90s. What's interesting, though, about Gioffre is in 2002, he would actually become a witness for the government, and he would flip and become a witness. So a lot of very involved people, as far as John Stanfa's both nuclear and extended family, were in the Mafia in Sicily. Now, there is little we know about Stanfa's father, a person called Giuseppe. He would be born in the late 1800s, and Giuseppe Stanfa would actually die in 1949 when Stanfa was just 8 years old. Now, we would know that Stanfa's father, remember, they didn't keep a lot of Mafia association records back in 10s, 20s, and 30s, but it is thought that Stanfa's father, who was a farmer, he would farm cattle and other livestock. He had a arrest record. At one point, he was actually banished in the 30s from Kokomo and had to go somewhere else. And he would eventually have his youngest son in 1940, which was John. But Giuseppe Stanfa obviously surely had some sort of Mafia association as well. Now, John Stanfa did not develop any sort of arrest record in Italy that we know of. Now, in the 50s, he would meet a local woman, a woman called Lena Concialdi, and the two would eventually marry. Now, Lena Stanfa would emigrate to America in the late 50s, and her husband, John, would follow her. He would stay in Sicily and eventually come over in 1964. Now, I want to make this clear. The Stanfa brothers, Ciro, Nicasio and Salvatore would all remain in Sicily, and some would face prosecution. It was said, though, that they would remain in Kokomo and really just continue their association with the mob. Stanfa would, as I say, enter the United States in and around 1964, according to immigrant records. Now, he would first turn up in New York City, where Stanfa would become affiliated as an associate with the Gambino crime family. Now, he would arrive in Philly several years later, but he would still maintain his connections to not only the Gambino crime family, but there are times as far as visits where Stanfa was seen in association with a person called Paolo Laduca, who was a Sicilian member of the Lucchese crime family. It was also said that he was close with Giuseppe and Tommaso Gambino, who, as we know, were connected to Carlo Gambino through a familial connection. So Stanfa had a lot of connection before coming to Philadelphia. What's interesting, though, about his time in Philadelphia is he was pretty much kind of just a hanger-on. Stanfa would identify as a bricklayer, and he would ultimately have 3 kids, a daughter, Sarah, who was born in 1967, his son, Giuseppe, a.k.a. Joe, who was born in 1971, and then a daughter, Maria, in 1976. Now, we can surmise that John Stanfa would be made into the Mafia here in Philadelphia, or in Philadelphia, in the mid-70s. He would ultimately become somewhat of a, not protege, but someone that Angelo Bruno liked. He was kind of a young guy. He was a Sicilian like Angelo Bruno, and Bruno would actually bring him on as a driver at one point, and he became pretty close to Angelo Bruno. So again, in the mob, in life, it's all about who you know, and John Stanfa was a young kind of Sicilian. He was trustworthy. He was quiet. He was low-key, someone that Bruno could obviously pal around with and liked. Now, what's interesting is, as we know, in March of 1980, Angelo Bruno was whacked in front of his home in and around 10th and Snyder in South Philadelphia. Now, that night, the driver of the vehicle of Bruno was, as we know, John Stanfa. Now, if you ask me, in the hit, John Stanfa is actually wounded. He is shot with a buckshot, and he's wounded. He gets blood all over him. Do I think John Stanfa knew what was going to go on that night? Probably. Do I think he was involved, like some people say? Maybe. I think he's probably at that point just saying, you know what? You just got to do what you just got to do, and I'm just going to fall in line. Now, what's interesting about after that is John Stanfa actually abandons his vehicle and runs away. And John Stanfa then goes into hiding. He would not turn up until several months later in December of 1980. John Stanfa would be arrested in Baltimore, Maryland, where he worked as a baker. He was just trying to blend into Baltimore in an Italian area, and he is picked up. He then faces charges, which he can be seen here, being whisked away. In April of 1981, John Stanfa, after lying to a grand jury multiple times about the night that Bruno was whacked, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for lying, and he would head away. John Stanfa would be released from federal prison in and around 1987. And by that point, the Philly family looked a lot different. I think the good thing, though, for John Stanfa was he missed the very turbulent times of Nicky Scarfo. He was not on the street during that time. So for Stanfa, it was probably good news. He may have been whisked up in some of the nonsense and the violence that was going on in Philly at the time through Nicky Scarfo. And by the time he gets out, Nicky Scarfo is in prison. Most of his people are in prison. And I think what Stanfa realizes is, okay, bit of a power vacuum here, right? Maybe I can go from being a lowly driver to everyone's gone. A lot of the old timers are gone. Maybe I can figure something out here. I'm a Sicilian. I had a lot of potential, right? So Stanfa kind of puts some ideas together. He kind of starts rallying the troops, if you will. And by this point, Stanfa and his family, most notably his 2 kids, would buy a kind of a shop storefront abandoned area of South Philadelphia, a couple of buildings, and he would conduct and create a company called Continental Food Distribution, where he would act as a food distributor. He also had other businesses as well, a construction company, from what I understand. And Stanfa kind of figures how he's going to take over the Philly mob. So for Stanfa, he moves to gain power. Now, the problem that he has is his group is kind of a misfit group. Now, there's some interesting guys in the crew, and I'll get into them in a second. But Stanfa realizes that his main kind of problem in taking over power is a young faction of wise guys called essentially the Young Turks. And they would include Joey Merlino, obviously on the right, as well as Michael Ciancaglini. Now, both Michael Ciancaglini and Joey Merlino are the sons of old school mobsters, right? The Chang's father, Joey, was in prison. He was an old school guy. Merlino's father, obviously, he's in prison as well. These guys are dead in on kind of what they want. They want to take over. And Ciancaglini, in terms of Michael and Joey, they're best friends, right? So they want to kind of put their heads together and take over the Philly mob. Now, for John Stanfa, his kind of group by then, by 1992-ish, he had various people running gambling, loan sharking, drug rackets. Money was kind of starting to come in. His crew around that time would include old school Philly mobster Felix Bacino, as well as Rosario Bellocci, who is a Sicilian, Biagio Adornetto. I'm sorry, this is Frank Martinez, not Rosario Bellocci. That's Frank Martinez, as well as Biagio Adornetto, Rosario Bellocci, Philip Coletti, and John Vesey. All of these people are kind of ragtag or associates of the crew. Some of them are high profile, like Frank Martinez and Felix Bacino. Now, also involved in this cohort is a former cop called Ron Previty, who we know a bunch about. Now, John Stanfa, by this point, would buy a home in and around 17th and Passyunk in Philadelphia. He would buy a property at 1743 West Passyunk Avenue, which in his life as a bricklayer, we can imagine he had people lay these bricks, and he would eventually live in that home. Now, remember, by this point, John Stanfa and Merlino are trying to kind of coexist. It was said that when Merlino gets out of prison in and around 1992, Merlino would actually become a made member of the Mafia in September of 1992, and John Stanfa would proceed over the ceremony alongside Joey's pal, Michael Ciancaglini. Now, what I also want to talk about is, and this I don't believe is connected to as the war starts, but several people believe that in January of 1992, Felix Bacino is whacked in his car in and around 12th and Mifflin in Philadelphia. And some people believe that Bacino is a high-ranking member of the Stanfa organization, and this incenses John Stanfa, and this is what starts the war. However, there's a lot of reason to believe that's not true, and that Bacino was told to not continue to screw around with Merlino people, and they were just fine with what happened. Because if you look into Bacino, he was killed in January of 1992. Stanfa and Merlino were close, and in fact, Merlino was made in September of 1992. So I don't think this has any kind of bearing as to why this war starts. We don't exactly know why this war starts. I guess the thought is Stanfa kind of becomes sour with Merlino in late 1992 into 1993 and kind of feels like, hey, this guy wants to take my power. He knew it. Maybe he viewed him as kind of a sly snake fox type of person. So Stanfa kind of starts it out. And that's exactly what happens, because in March 3rd of 1993, Michael Ciancaglini's home is shot up in the area of 12th and McKean in Philadelphia. So they don't hit Michael Chang, but his house is shot up. A day later, Michael Ciancaglini's brother, Joey Chang, who is a key member of the Stanfa organization and an enemy by this point of the Merlino camp, he is not mortally wounded, but he is shot and in critical condition in and around Warfield Street, right where he had a luncheonette in the Stanfa camp. Stanfa owned all the buildings up there, and Joey Chang had a luncheonette. He goes in for work one day, and the business is shot up. A waitress is whacked. Joey Chang survives, but he's incapacitated essentially. So this is kind of the start of the war, March of 1993. And remember, we've done a video on the Ciancaglinis. I'll make sure I include the video. They all kind of center on different camps. Michael and John Ciancaglini side with Merlino. Joey Chang sides with Stanfa. So it's brother against brother. It's one of the most Shakespearean tales in Mafia history. It's quite interesting. Now, the big thing is on August 5th of 1993, Michael Chang and Joey Merlino are shot outside of a clubhouse in the area of 6th and Catherine Streets in South Philadelphia. It had been said, according to Philip Coletti, that they had tried to kill Merlino many times, but they were never successful in doing so. This was obviously the biggest way they felt they could kill Merlino. Now, according to John Vesey, who was one of the triggermen in shooting Mikey Chang and Joey Merlino alongside Coletti, Vesey would say that initially they drove around but couldn't take the shot due to the fact that Vesey's brother Billy was at the club and outside with Merlino and Chang at that point. They went around the block again. Billy Vesey was gone, and they took the shot at Merlino and Ciancaglini. Ciancaglini would die in the shooting. Merlino would be wounded. So the war is on. Now for Stanfa, he would have to face the music just several days later in the same month of August of 1993. John Stanfa and his son Joey would be driving on this piece of roadway right here, the Schuylkill Expressway, in and around the Vare Avenue exit. As they traveled to their food distribution company, a van would pull up alongside of them on the highway and begin spraying their car. Now, Joey Stanfa, John's son, would be wounded. He'd be hit in the face. He would survive. This was nuts. South Philly was out of control. Now, days later, in September of 1993, key Merlino bookmaker and associate Frankie Bronze Baldino would be shot as he got into his car in the parking lot of the old Melrose Diner in South Philadelphia. John Vesey was the triggerman. So again, Merlino people are being shot. Stanfa people are being shot. Stanfa's own son was shot. Like, Philadelphia was out of control. South Philly was jumping. Another mob war had erupted. But for John Stanfa, things were beginning to fall apart for him, not only from a standpoint of his safety, but he would be indicted. In March of 1994, the dust clears somewhat, and John Stanfa is indicted on labor racketeering, murder, extortion, among other stuff, alongside 23 others, including members of the Mafia, or not members, but members and associates of the Mafia, including John Vesey, Sergio Battaglia, Tony Buck Piccolo, Gaten Lucibello, Vincent Filippelli, and even a lawyer is swept up in this, a person called Salvatore Avina, who, according to the feds and court papers, they contend that John Stanfa would tell an associate, Sergio Battaglia, quote, at one point, "You know what I'll do? I'll get a knife, I'll blank out his tongue, and we'll send it to his wife." Now, that had something to do with what we believe Gaten Lucibello, who had soured with that organization. Now, I'm not going to say what he said they would do because we know how YouTube can be at times, but he was doing this in the office of a lawyer. Now, Salavino would ultimately be hit with obstruction and other charges. So for John Stanfa, things had fallen apart, and they would fall apart even worse because many people would flip, including John Vesey and other associates of the Mafia. Now, the trial was set to begin in October of 1995, and John Vesey would be one of the first to testify. However, in early October 1995, as the morning came for John Vesey to testify, as we know he would get some bad news, his brother Billy would be shot multiple times in the area of South Bouvier Street and Oregon Avenue in South Philadelphia. Billy Vesey's killer remains on the street. We don't know who whacked him. There have been various theories, but no one has ever paid for whacking Billy Vesey. John Vesey, though, would take the stand anyway and was a very, very good witness. It would lead several weeks later in November of 1995. John Stanfa would be convicted on 33 of 35 counts. In July of 1996, John Stanfa would be sentenced to life in prison. He currently sits at FCI Schuylkill in Pennsylvania. He is 83 years old. We have seen many photos pop up over the years of John Stanfa in prison. And according to multiple sources that I have that I've spoken to that have been in prison with John Stanfa, at one point while he was at Leavenworth in Kansas, John Stanfa actually served as kind of the food guy as far as making sure food was coming into the commissary due to the fact that in the streets, he had a food distribution company. Now, obviously, at this point, John Stanfa is in his 80s, and he has been in prison for going on 30 years. Now, in and around 2012, John Stanfa's son, Joey, would actually open a pizzeria and restaurant at the former location of the Warfield Luncheonette, where Joey Chang was killed not killed, but almost killed many years before. According to the lawyer of Joey Stanfa, he would say, quote, "The only hit over there these days is the chicken cutlets, meatballs, and broccoli rabe." He would contend that Joey Stanfa is, quote, 100% completely legitimate. Even the government rats who testified against his father said so. Now, the restaurant would close several years ago, and what Joey Stanfa does today, I am unaware of. I would think he is just living a normal life and probably goes to see his father on a regular basis. John Stanfa is a guy who, was he a good boss? No. In fact, he was one of the worst bosses possibly in the history of the Mafia. He made people who weren't even Italian. He had cops around him. He did very little. He wasn't around for very long and went to war quite quickly. But the matriculation of John Stanfa is quite interesting. He was very connected in terms of Sicily, even in New York. It's always a wonder, though, that by the 90s, though, everybody was gone, and John Stanfa had to make do with what was left in the Mafia. I want to mention a quote that John Stanfa had that came from a wiretap. He would say at one point, "I was born and raised that way. I'm going to die that way, but with the right people. Over here, though, this life is like kindergarten." So Stanfa lamented that the Mafia was just a mess. And I think he was just a product of, by the time he got out of prison, all the old school guys were gone, and he had to make do with what he had. I think he's largely misunderstood. And he went to war with a guy who, and guys who they both fought, they lost key people. And Stanfa in the end had to pay for it. I want to end this with taking a look at this photo. It's very grainy. It's hard to see. It's black and white. But it's John Stanfa and Joey Merlino. And I had a laugh this morning thinking about, someone in prison trying to teach John Stanfa, the old Sicilian, what a podcast actually is. And then them trying to make John Stanfa understand that Joey Merlino is doing this currently. And it made me laugh thinking about how life works. The other night, Joey Merlino posted video of him in Louis Vuitton walking in to a Sixer game, sitting courtside, hanging out with Allen Iverson. And you think of John Stanfa sitting in prison, just waiting to die. And kind of the difference in the two, they both either cooperated, both did what they had to do, but both had very similar trajectories, but very different ends. And I have to think of, I would love to be a fly on the wall because we know John Stanfa knows about this, what he thinks of this. I would love to know. It's fascinating to think about. What do you think John Stanfa thinks of Joey Merlino's podcast? We're going to guess. He probably doesn't have any good words for him. As always, thank you for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.